On a bright spring morning in a quiet suburban neighborhood, life changed forever for a 16-year-old girl. The day had started like any other. She woke up to her alarm, got ready for school, and headed downstairs for breakfast. Her father, as always, was already at the kitchen table with his morning coffee and newspaper. "Have a great day at school, sweetheart," he said with his usual warm smile, giving her a quick hug before heading to work. Little did she know this would be their last morning together. Her father was a kind-hearted man who worked as an accountant at a local firm. He was the type of dad who never missed a school event, taught her to ride a bike, and still took her for ice cream when she was having a bad day, even at 16. He had this special way of making everything better with just a few words and his gentle presence. That afternoon, while sitting in her chemistry class, she noticed her phone buzzing repeatedly. 3 missed calls from her mother, unusual since her mom knew she was in school. When she finally stepped out of class and called back, her mother's voice was shaking. "You need to come home right now," her mother said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Your aunt is coming to pick you up." The drive home was a blur. Her aunt kept glancing at her with worried eyes but wouldn't say what was wrong. As they pulled into the driveway, she saw several cars parked outside their house, her grandparents' car, her uncle's truck, and even their neighbor's vehicle. Walking through the front door, she found her mother sitting on the couch, surrounded by family members. Her mother's eyes were red and swollen from crying. The moment their eyes met, she knew something terrible had happened. "Your father," her mother began, voice breaking. "He had a heart attack at work today. The paramedics, they tried everything they could, but..." She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. The world seemed to stop spinning. The girl stood there, unable to move, unable to process what she was hearing. Her father, who had just hugged her that morning, who had plans to help her practice driving that weekend, who was supposed to be there for her graduation next year, was gone. The next few hours passed in a strange haze. Relatives came and went, bringing food nobody felt like eating. People kept hugging her, offering words of comfort that didn't really register. Her mother made phone calls, spoke with funeral directors, and tried to hold herself together while planning arrangements nobody ever wants to make. That night, lying in her bed, she could hear her mother crying in the next room. She clutched the teddy bear her father had given her on her 10th birthday, the one she'd claimed she was too old for but secretly kept on her shelf. The house felt different now, as if all the warmth had been sucked out of it. She remembered how just last weekend they'd all gone for a family picnic. Her father had attempted to fly a kite he bought, making everyone laugh with his failed attempts before finally getting it airborne. How could someone so full of life just be gone? The most difficult part was the memories that kept flooding back, simple moments she'd taken for granted. The way he'd sing off-key while making pancakes on Sunday mornings. How he'd leave little encouraging notes in her lunchbox, even though she was in high school. The dad jokes that made her roll her eyes but secretly smile. Each memory now felt like a small stab to her heart. Looking through her phone, she found their last text conversation from that morning. He'd sent her a funny meme about chemistry since she had a test coming up, followed by "You've got this, kiddo." Such a normal, everyday exchange. How could she have known it would be their last? Sleep didn't come easily that night. She tossed and turned, part of her hoping this was just a terrible nightmare she'd wake up from. But morning came, and with it, the heavy reality that this was her new normal, a world without her father in it. The house was flooded with visitors the next day. Everyone shared stories about her father, how he'd helped them move, offered financial advice, or just been there when they needed someone to talk to. She learned things about him she'd never known before. How he'd secretly paid for a colleague's child's medical bills when they were struggling, or how he'd spend his lunch breaks tutoring junior employees. Her father's boss came by, clearly shaken. He explained how her father had been in a meeting when he suddenly clutched his chest and collapsed. The company nurse had started CPR immediately, and the ambulance had arrived within minutes, but sometimes, even when everything is done right, it's not enough. The medical examiner later explained it was a massive heart attack, something they called a widowmaker. There had been no warning signs, no way to predict or prevent it. Her father had been healthy, exercised regularly, and had just had a clean bill of health at his last checkup 3 months ago. She found herself getting angry at strange things, at the TV shows they used to watch together, at his empty parking spot in the garage, at his coffee mug still sitting in the dishwasher from that morning. It wasn't fair. They were supposed to have more time. He was supposed to see her graduate, help her move into her college dorm, walk her down the aisle someday. As the day of the funeral approached, she felt a growing sense of dread. How was she supposed to say goodbye? How could anyone expect her to stand there and accept that she'd never hear his laugh again, never feel his comforting hugs, never get to tell him about her day? The hardest part was watching her mother try to be strong for her. She'd catch her mom talking to her father's picture when she thought no one was around, asking him how she was supposed to do this alone. They'd been high school sweethearts, married for 20 years. Now her mother had to figure out how to be both parents and deal with her own grief at the same time. That night, as she helped her mother pick out clothes for her father to wear in his coffin, the reality of what was coming hit her full force. Tomorrow, she would have to face the hardest day of her young life. Tomorrow, she would have to say goodbye to the first man she ever loved, her dad, her protector, her hero. Little did she know, fate had other plans, and the next day would bring something nobody could have expected. The funeral home stood quiet and sullen on that cloudy morning. The girl's hands trembled as she smoothed down her black dress, the one her father had helped her pick out for a school dance just months ago. Now she was wearing it for a very different occasion. People started arriving early, filling the parking lot with their cars. Each new face brought fresh waves of sympathy, more hugs she didn't want, more words that couldn't fix anything. She stood beside her mother at the entrance, accepting condolences from faces that blurred together. He was such a good man, they kept saying. Gone too soon. If there's anything you need. The words washed over her like waves, meaningful but somehow empty at the same time. What she needed was her dad back, and nobody could give her that. The funeral director, a gentle-faced woman with kind eyes, approached them softly. "Would you like a moment alone with him before we begin the service?" she asked. The girl looked at her mother, who nodded slowly. Together, they walked into the room where her father lay. The coffin was beautiful, polished wood with silver handles, surrounded by flowers. But nothing could prepare her for seeing her father lying there. He looked peaceful, almost like he was sleeping, dressed in his favorite suit, the one he wore to special occasions. Someone had even placed his reading glasses in his breast pocket, just the way he always carried them. Her mother squeezed her hand and whispered, "Take your time, sweetheart. I'll give you a moment alone with him." She watched her mother step back, shoulders shaking slightly as she tried to maintain her composure. Standing there, looking down at her father's face, memories flooded back. Just 2 weeks ago, they'd been planning her birthday celebration. He'd promised to teach her to drive his old pickup truck once summer came. There were so many promises left unfulfilled, so many words left unsaid. The makeup they'd used couldn't quite hide the slight bluish tint to his skin, and his face looked different somehow, too still, too perfect. But his hands were folded just the way they always were when he was relaxed, and someone had even remembered to place his wedding ring on his finger. She reached out tentatively to touch his hand. It was cold, so unlike the warm, strong hands that had pushed her on swings, taught her to ride a bike, and wiped away her tears when she was sad. The hands that had always made her feel safe were now still and lifeless. Tears began falling freely now, dropping onto his suit jacket. "Daddy," she whispered, the word catching in her throat. "I'm not ready for this. I'm not ready to say goodbye." Without thinking, she leaned down to hug him one last time, just as she had done thousands of times before. Her mother made a small sound of protest from somewhere behind her, probably worried about messing up the funeral arrangements, but she couldn't help herself. As she wrapped her arms around him, pressing her face against his chest the way she had done since she was little, something felt different. Through her tears and grief, through the fog of sadness that had enveloped her for days, something nagged at the edge of her consciousness. The suit fabric felt cool against her cheek, but underneath was that warmth. She held still, barely breathing, trying to understand what she was feeling. There, beneath her ear, pressed against his chest, was that the faintest flutter of movement. Her heart began racing. Was her mind playing tricks on her? Was grief making her imagine things? She stayed there, barely daring to move, pressing her ear harder against his chest. The room was completely silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. And then she felt it again, unmistakable this time. A slight warmth, a tiny movement, so faint she might have missed it if she hadn't been holding him so close. Could it be possible? Was she going crazy? "Mom," she called out, her voice shaking. "Mom, I think I feel something." Her mother rushed forward, concern etched on her face. "Honey, I know this is hard, but we need to." "No, Mom, listen." She grabbed her mother's hand and placed it where she had felt the warmth. "Can you feel it? There's warmth here, and I swear I felt something move." The funeral director had entered the room, probably wondering what was causing the commotion. "Is everything all right?" she asked, moving closer. "Please," the girl begged, looking at both adults. "Please check." "I know it sounds crazy, but something's not right. He feels warm." The funeral director's professional composure slipped for a moment as she glanced between the girl and her father. Slowly, carefully, she approached the coffin and placed 2 fingers against his neck, her face concentrated. The next few seconds seemed to stretch into eternity. The girl held her breath, watching the funeral director's face. Then suddenly, the woman's eyes widened. "Call 911, she said sharply, already reaching for her phone. "Now." The room erupted into controlled chaos. The funeral director was speaking rapidly into her phone, using medical terms the girl didn't understand. Her mother was crying, holding onto her father's hand, whispering his name over and over. People began rushing in, drawn by the commotion. The girl stood there, frozen in place, watching as the peaceful funeral parlor transformed into an emergency scene. Was this really happening? Had her final embrace somehow revealed something everyone had missed? Within minutes, paramedics burst through the doors, equipment in hand. The girl and her mother were gently but firmly moved aside as the medical team began their work. She watched, hardly daring to hope, as they checked vital signs and spoke in urgent, professional tones. "We've got a pulse," one of them announced. "It's weak, but it's there." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. How was this possible? Her father, who had been declared dead days ago, who they were about to bury, somehow had a pulse. She grabbed her mother's hand, both of them watching in shock as the paramedics worked. This couldn't be real, could it? Yet there they were, watching her father being carefully transferred from his coffin onto a gurney, medical equipment being attached to him, urgent voices calling out readings and instructions. As they rushed him out to the waiting ambulance, the girl and her mother followed in a daze. The funeral guests stood in shocked silence, watching this miracle unfold before their eyes. Standing in the parking lot, watching the ambulance pull away with lights flashing, the girl felt like she was in a dream. Just moments ago, she had been saying her final goodbye. Now, somehow, impossibly, there was hope. Her mother's car keys jangled as she pulled them from her purse with shaking hands. "Come on," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "We need to get to the hospital." As they followed the ambulance, the girl couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Was this really possible, or would this glimpse of hope be crushed? Only time would tell. The drive to the hospital felt like the longest journey of their lives. The girl sat in the passenger seat, her mother's knuckles white on the steering wheel as they followed the ambulance's flashing lights through traffic. Neither of them spoke. What could they possibly say in a moment like this? The emergency room entrance was a blur of activity when they arrived. Medical staff rushed around their father's gurney, shouting terms that sounded like a foreign language. Words like vital signs, cardiac activity, and immediate intervention floated through the air. "You'll need to wait here," a nurse said gently, directing them to the waiting room. "The doctors need space to work. Someone will come update you as soon as possible." The waiting room was eerily quiet compared to the chaos they'd just witnessed. Their mother paced back and forth, phone in hand, trying to explain the impossible situation to family members. How do you tell people that the funeral they were just attending had turned into a rush to the hospital? "I don't understand," the girl whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "How is this possible? He was—" She couldn't bring herself to say the word dead. Not now, not when there was a chance, however small, that he might be alive. A young doctor appeared, his face serious but kind. "Your father is showing signs of what we call Lazarus syndrome," he explained. "It's extremely rare, but there have been documented cases where people have shown signs of life after being declared deceased. We're doing everything we can." Hours passed like years. The waiting room slowly filled with family members and friends who had followed from the funeral home, all still dressed in their formal black clothes. Nobody seemed to know what to say or do. This wasn't a situation anyone could prepare for. The girl's phone kept buzzing with messages from classmates who had heard the news. Apparently, word had spread quickly through their small town. Some messages expressed disbelief, others hope, but she couldn't bring herself to respond to many of them. Around midnight, another doctor appeared, older this time, with gray hair and tired eyes. The girl and her mother stood up immediately, hearts pounding. "Your father is stable," he said, and the room collectively exhaled. "His vital signs are weak, but they're there. We've placed him in intensive care and have him on life support. The next 24 hours will be crucial." "But how?" her mother asked, voice trembling. "They said his heart had stopped. We were about to bury him." The doctor adjusted his glasses thoughtfully. "The human body is still full of mysteries," he explained. "Sometimes, particularly in cases of cardiac arrest, there can be a delayed return of spontaneous circulation. It's incredibly rare, but it happens. The cold temperature in the funeral home might have actually helped preserve his brain function." "Can we see him?" the girl asked, barely able to get the words out. The doctor nodded slowly. "Briefly. He's hooked up to a lot of equipment and he's not conscious, but you can sit with him for a few minutes." Walking into the ICU was like entering another world. Machines beat steadily, monitoring every aspect of her father's condition. Tubes and wires connected him to various devices, making him look small and vulnerable in the hospital bed. But he was warm. His chest rose and fell with each breath, aided by a ventilator. His heart monitor showed a steady, if weak, rhythm. It was nothing short of miraculous. The girl took his hand, the same hand that had been cold and lifeless just hours ago in the funeral home. Now she could feel warmth returning, could see the color slowly coming back to his skin. "Daddy," she whispered, squeezing his hand gently. "I knew you wouldn't leave us. I knew it when I hugged you. Somehow, I just knew." Her mother stood on the other side of the bed, tears streaming down her face as she stroked her husband's forehead. The wedding ring that had been carefully placed on his finger for the funeral now seemed like a symbol of hope rather than goodbye. Outside the ICU, their family waited anxiously for news. Phones were ringing as word spread through their community. The local news had already picked up the story. It wasn't every day that someone came back to life during their own funeral. Medical teams came and went, checking vital signs, adjusting medications, monitoring every slight change in his condition. Each small improvement was celebrated, each setback met with renewed prayers and hope. The girl couldn't help but think about how different this night could have been. If she hadn't hugged him one last time, if she hadn't noticed that faint warmth, if she hadn't insisted something was wrong, would anyone have known? How many other people might have been buried while still having a chance at life? As dawn approached, the doctor returned with cautiously optimistic news. Her father's vital signs were getting stronger. His body was slowly warming up to normal temperature. His brain activity looked promising, though they wouldn't know the full extent of any potential damage until he woke up, if he woke up. "This is already a miracle," the doctor said gently. "But please understand, we're in uncharted territory here. The fact that he's showing such positive signs is remarkable, but we need to take things 1 hour at a time." The girl nodded, understanding but not really caring about the medical cautions. Her father was alive, against all odds. Despite all medical explanation, he was alive. That was all that mattered right now. Looking out the hospital window at the rising sun, she thought about how differently this day had started. They had woken up planning to say a final goodbye. Instead, they were watching the monitors beep steadily, counting each breath, cherishing every sign of life. "Come on, Dad," she whispered, holding his warm hand tight. "You've made it this far. You can make it the rest of the way. We're all here waiting for you." Little did she know, the greatest challenges and the most amazing moments were still to come. The intensive care unit became their new home over the next few days. The girl and her mother took turns staying with her father, neither wanting to leave his side for too long. The steady beeping of monitors became a comforting rhythm, each sound confirming he was still fighting. News of the miracle at the funeral home had spread far beyond their small town. Reporters gathered outside the hospital, eager to cover the story of the man who came back to life at his own funeral. The hospital staff helped keep them at bay, protecting the family's privacy during this delicate time. On the third day, while the girl was doing her homework in the corner of the ICU room, she heard a change in the breathing pattern of the ventilator. Looking up, she saw her father's fingers twitching slightly. "Mom," she called out, dropping her textbook. "Mom, come quick. I think he's moving." Her mother, who had been talking to a nurse outside, rushed in. They watched, hardly daring to breathe, as her father's eyelids fluttered. The nurse quickly checked his vital signs and called for the doctor. "Squeeze my hand if you can hear me," the doctor said clearly, holding her father's hand. Everyone in the room held their breath. Slowly, weakly, but unmistakably, his fingers closed around the doctor's hand. The girl burst into tears, but this time they were tears of joy. Her mother covered her mouth with her hands, trying to stifle her sobs. The medical team moved quickly, performing various tests and checks. Over the next few hours, her father became more responsive. They removed the breathing tube as he began breathing on his own. His eyes opened fully, confused but aware. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse and weak, but it was the most beautiful sound the girl had ever heard. "What happened?" he managed to whisper. How do you explain to someone that they were technically dead, about to be buried, and somehow came back to life? The doctor took charge, explaining things slowly and carefully, making sure not to overwhelm him. Her father's face showed disbelief as he listened. "The funeral?" "I was at my own funeral," he asked, looking between his wife and daughter. "You were," the girl said softly, holding his hand. "But I hugged you, and I felt something wasn't right. You were still warm, Dad. You weren't gone at all." The medical team continued their tests, amazed by his rapid improvement. Brain scans showed no significant damage, despite the time his heart had been stopped. His memory was intact. He remembered everything up to the moment he collapsed at work. "It's like his body went into a type of suspended animation," one doctor explained. The cold temperature at the funeral home might have actually helped preserve his organs. It's absolutely unprecedented. As news of his awakening spread, the hospital received calls from medical researchers around the world, all interested in studying this extraordinary case. But for the girl and her mother, the medical miracle was secondary to the simple joy of having him back. Each day brought new progress. Her father began physical therapy, working to regain his strength. The girl would sit with him during these sessions, encouraging him as he took his first shaky steps, helping him with the exercises the therapists prescribed. "I heard you, he told her one afternoon during a therapy break. "When I was, wherever I was. I could feel your hug, hear your voice. It was like being in a very deep sleep, but I knew you were there." The girl spent hours telling him about everything that had happened, how they'd planned his funeral, how she felt that something was wrong, how the medical team had rushed him to the hospital. He listened with wonder, still trying to process the incredible story of his own death and return. The doctors continued to monitor him closely, documenting every aspect of his recovery for medical journals. His case would go on to change protocols around death certification and waiting periods before burial, potentially saving other lives in the future. Visitors came in steady streams once he was strong enough. Family, friends, co-workers, all still amazed to see him alive and recovering. Each person had their own story of where they'd been when they heard the news, how they couldn't believe it at first. "You know what's funny?" her father said one evening as they watched the sunset through his hospital window. "I'd always told you that hugs could fix anything. Turns out I was right. Your hug literally brought me back to life." The girl smiled, remembering all the times he'd insisted on a hug when she was sad or upset. "I guess I finally listened to you, Dad," she replied, squeezing his hand. The medical team began discussing discharge plans as his strength returned. There would need to be regular follow-up appointments, cardiac monitoring, and lifestyle changes, but he was well enough to continue his recovery at home. "It's like getting a second chance at life," he said, looking at his family. "And I don't intend to waste it." The girl watched as her father packed up the cards and flowers that had accumulated in his hospital room. Just 2 weeks ago, these same flowers had been meant for his funeral. Now they were celebrating his recovery instead. As they prepared to leave the hospital, one of the nurses who had cared for him since that first dramatic night stopped by. "She said, "in all my years of nursing, I've never seen anything like this. Your story gives hope to so many people." The girl thought about how different life would be if she hadn't followed her instincts that day at the funeral home. One final hug had changed everything. As they helped her father into the wheelchair for his trip home, she knew their story was far from over. Bringing her father home felt surreal, like a dream she was afraid to wake up from. Their house, which had been filled with mourners just weeks ago, now buzzed with a different kind of energy. Friends and neighbors stopped by with home-cooked meals and welcome home banners, celebrating this second chance at life. The first few days were a period of adjustment. Her father needed help with simple tasks he'd once done without thinking. Walking up the stairs left him breathless, and he had to take frequent rest breaks. But his determination never wavered. "Baby steps," he would say whenever he got frustrated. "I came back from the dead. I can certainly learn to climb these stairs again." Their living room transformed into a temporary recovery space. The medical equipment seemed out of place among family photos and comfortable furniture, but they were grateful for every beeping monitor and medication reminder. Each one meant he was still with them. The girl took on new responsibilities, helping with his medication schedule and exercises. She learned to check his vital signs, measure his oxygen levels, and recognize warning signs that might mean trouble. It was scary at first, but she found strength she didn't know she had. One morning, while helping him organize his pills, he looked at her with tears in his eyes. "I'm so proud of you," he said softly. "You've been so strong through all of this. You saved my life, you know that." She swallowed hard, remembering that moment in the funeral home. "I just couldn't let you go," she replied. "Something told me it wasn't your time yet." Their mother watched over both of them like a hawk, balancing work with care duties. She'd taken lead from her job initially, but now worked from home to stay close. The dining room table became her office, allowing her to keep an eye on her husband while handling business calls. The medical community continued to study their case. Doctors made house calls, something rarely done anymore, to document his recovery. Researchers interviewed the whole family, particularly interested in the girl's experience of detecting warmth during what should have been a final goodbye. "Your instincts changed medical history," one researcher told her. "We're reviewing procedures worldwide because of what happened here." Her father's story sparked discussions about death certification protocols. Medical journals published articles about Lazarus syndrome, using their experience as a prime example. The girl found it strange to see their family's most intense personal moment discussed in scientific terms. School became an interesting challenge. Everyone knew her story. She was the girl whose dad came back to life. Some people asked thoughtful questions, while others just stared. Her teachers were understanding, allowing her to catch up on missed work at her own pace. "How do you handle all the attention?" her best friend asked one day during lunch. "I just focus on what matters," she replied. "Dad's alive. Everything else is just background noise." The local newspaper wanted to do a feature story about their experience. After much discussion, the family agreed, hoping their story might help others. The reporters sat in their living room, recording as they shared their perspective on the miracle that had changed their lives. "What made you hug him that day?" the reporter asked the girl. Most people wouldn't have done that in a funeral home. She thought carefully before answering. "He always told me that love is stronger than anything. I guess I just needed one last moment to show him how much I loved him. I never expected it would actually bring him back." Her father's recovery continued to surprise his doctors. His heart grew stronger, his stamina improved, and soon he could climb the stairs without stopping to rest. Physical therapy sessions became less frequent as he regained his independence, but the experience had changed him in other ways. He looked at life differently now, appreciating small moments that might have passed unnoticed before. Morning coffee with his family became a sacred ritual. Evening walks, even short ones, were treasured opportunities for conversation. "You know what I missed most?" he said during one of these walks. "Just this. Being here, watching the sunset, hearing about your day. When people talk about near-death experiences, they mention seeing lights or feeling peace. For me, it was hearing your voice, feeling your hug, that brought me back." The girl's own perspective on life shifted too. She understood now how quickly things could change, how precious each moment was. Simple things, doing homework while her father watched TV, hearing him laugh at bad jokes, watching him garden again, became extraordinary gifts. Their home security system caught an unexpected moment one night, her father dancing with her mother in the kitchen, both still in their pajamas. The girl watched from the doorway as they swayed to silent music, holding each other close, celebrating life in their own quiet way. Medical checkups became routine, each one bringing good news. His heart was healing well, his body growing stronger. The doctors called him their miracle patient, though he insisted the real miracle was his daughter's love and intuition. Science can explain the medical side, he told visitors. But what made my daughter sense I was still there? That's the real mystery, the power of love and connection. That's what brought me back. As weeks turned into months, their story began spreading beyond medical circles. People from around the world sent letters sharing similar experiences or expressing hope for their own loved ones. The girl kept these letters in a special box, touched by how their family's miracle had affected others. One evening, helping her father sort through some of these letters, she found one that particularly moved them. It was from another teenage girl whose father was in a coma. "Your story gives me hope," she had written. "It reminds me that miracles can happen, that love really is stronger than death." They sat together, father and daughter, reading more letters as the sun set outside their window. Each one reminded them how fortunate they were, how their second chance was also a gift to others who needed hope. "Ready for our evening walk?" her father asked, standing up with strength that grew more evident each day. The girl smiled, taking his arm. "Always, Dad, always." 6 months after the miracle at the funeral home, life had found a new rhythm. The girl's father had progressed from careful steps around the house to joining her on morning jogs. His recovery wasn't just physical, his whole outlook on life had transformed. Their kitchen became the heart of their renewed family life. Instead of rushing through meals, they now sat together, sharing stories and making plans. Her father had taken up cooking, something he'd never had time for before. The smell of fresh bread and experimental recipes often filled their home. "You know what's funny?" he said one morning while flipping pancakes. "I used to think I was too busy for this stuff. Now I realize these moments are what life's really about." The medical community continued to study their case. Their family's experience had sparked changes in how hospitals handled cardiac arrests and death declarations. New protocols were being developed, inspired by their story, potentially saving other lives. One sunny afternoon, a letter arrived from a major medical conference. They wanted her father to be a keynote speaker, sharing his unique perspective as someone who had experienced what doctors called autoresuscitation, but what their family simply called their miracle. "They want you to speak too," he told his daughter, holding out the invitation. "They want to hear from the person who actually noticed something wasn't right." The girl felt nervous about speaking in front of medical professionals. "What would I even say?" she wondered aloud. "Just tell them the truth," her mother suggested. "Tell them about trusting your instincts, about the power of not giving up." Preparing for the conference became a family project. They worked together on the presentation, combining medical facts with their personal experience. Her father practiced his speech in the living room, while she wrote and rewrote her part. The day of the conference arrived. The audience was filled with doctors, researchers, and medical students from around the world. The girl's hands shook as she approached the podium, but when she looked out at the crowd, she saw them lean forward, eager to hear their story. "I'm not a doctor or a scientist," she began. "I'm just a daughter who couldn't say goodbye. But that day taught me something important. Sometimes the heart knows things that science can't explain." She described the moment in the funeral home, the inexplicable warmth she'd felt, the certainty that something wasn't right. The audience listened intently as she explained how it felt to discover signs of life in what should have been a final farewell. Her father's speech followed, offering his perspective on being the man who came back. He talked about the strange sensation of hearing loved ones' voices while seemingly unconscious, about the power of human connection, and about how the experience had changed his view of life and death. "We often talk about the scientific aspects of death," he told the audience. "But there's something else, something we don't fully understand about the connection between people who love each other." My daughter sensed I was still there when all medical evidence said otherwise. The impact of their presentation was immediate. Doctors approached them afterward, sharing similar stories they'd encountered or asking detailed questions about the experience. Medical students took notes, clearly affected by this personal perspective on what they'd only studied in textbooks. Back home, life continued to evolve. Their story had opened unexpected doors. Support groups for families dealing with similar situations reached out, asking them to share their experience. The girl found herself becoming an advocate for trusting intuition in medical situations. Her father's recovery exceeded all expectations. Regular checkups showed his heart was stronger than ever. He took his second chance seriously, making healthy choices and cherishing every moment with his family. One evening, while helping her with homework, he paused and looked at her thoughtfully. "You know, sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been so brave that day." She looked up from her textbook. "Brave? I was just being selfish. I wasn't ready to let you go." He smiled, taking her hand. "That's not selfishness, that's love. And sometimes love is stronger than what we think is possible." Their story began inspiring others in unexpected ways. A local hospital started a program allowing family members more time with loved ones after a parent death, acknowledging that medical science doesn't have all the answers. The girl's school asked her to speak at an assembly about trusting your instincts and the importance of hope. Standing before her peers, she shared how one moment of refusing to give up had changed everything. "Sometimes the hardest thing is believing in something when everyone else has given up," she told them. "But that's often when miracles happen." Their family became closer than ever, appreciating the gift of extra time they'd been given. Simple moments took on new meaning: watching TV together, Sunday morning breakfasts, even arguments about household chores felt precious. 1 year after the miracle, they organized a celebration of life. The same people who had gathered for what they thought was a funeral now came together to celebrate recovery and renewal. The funeral home director even attended, still amazed by what she had witnessed. "Your story changed how I look at my work," the director told them. "Now I always double and triple check. You never know when another miracle might happen." As the girl watched her father laughing with guests, dancing with her mother, and enjoying every moment of the party, she realized their miracle hadn't just changed their lives, it had created ripples of hope and possibility that continued to spread. That night, after the guests had gone home, her father hugged her extra tight. "Thank you," he whispered, "for not giving up on me." The girl hugged him back, remembering that moment in the funeral home that had changed everything. "I never will, Dad. I never will." 2 years had passed since that extraordinary day at the funeral home. The girl, now preparing for college, sat in their backyard garden with her father, looking through old photos and reminiscing about their journey. The garden itself was a symbol of their second chance. Her father had planted it during his recovery, saying he wanted to create something beautiful from their experience. Now it bloomed with colorful flowers and herbs, a living reminder of renewal and hope. "Remember how scared we all were those first few weeks after you came home?" she asked, pointing to a photo taken shortly after his hospital release. He nodded, smiling. "I was basically wrapped in bubble wrap. Your mother wouldn't let me walk to the mailbox without supervision." Their story had taken on a life of its own. Medical textbooks now included their case in chapters about cardiac activity and death certification. Hospitals worldwide had adopted new protocols requiring extended observation periods and additional checks before declaring death. "Last week, I got another letter," her father said, pulling an envelope from his pocket. "A doctor in another country followed our case's protocol. They found vital signs in a patient everyone thought was gone. Another life saved because you trusted your instincts that day." The girl's mother joined them, carrying lemonade. She had finally stopped jumping every time her husband coughed or seemed tired. The fear of losing him again had slowly been replaced by gratitude for each new day. The support group called again, her mother mentioned. "They want us to speak at their annual conference. So many families find strength in our story." Their experience had created a ripple effect in the medical community. Research into Lazarus syndrome increased, leading to better understanding of the phenomenon. Their case was cited in medical journals, discussed at conferences, and taught in medical schools. The girl had chosen her college major inspired by their experience. She planned to study biomedical engineering, hoping to develop better tools for detecting faint vital signs. Her father's case had shown her how thin the line between life and death could be. "You know what still amazes me?" her father said, looking at the garden he'd created. "How one hug changed everything. not just for us, but for so many others. They'd received countless letters over the years from people sharing similar experiences or finding hope in their story. Some had questioned their own loved ones' deaths, leading to discoveries of lingering vital signs. Others simply found comfort knowing that sometimes, against all odds, miracles do happen. Their local hospital had created a special waiting period protocol, unofficially named after their family. The extra time allowed for thorough checks and gave families more time to say goodbye, or in rare cases, discover signs of life others had missed. The girl's high school graduation had been especially emotional. Her father, who'd nearly missed seeing her grow up, stood proudly watching her receive her diploma. The whole audience knew their story, and the applause seemed to celebrate not just her achievement, but their miracle too. "Remember what you told that reporter last month?" her mother asked. "About how love doesn't always follow medical rules." The girl nodded. Their story had attracted media attention again after similar cases emerged in other countries. She'd been interviewed about her experience, trying to explain the inexplicable feeling that had made her check for signs of life. "I just said what I believed," she replied. "That sometimes the heart knows things that machines can't measure." Her father reached for her hand. "You taught the medical world something important. Numbers and monitors matter, but so does human intuition. So does love." They'd started a small foundation, helping families navigate similar situations and funding research into detection of vital signs. Their dining room table often hosted medical researchers, families sharing similar experiences, and people seeking hope. The garden had become a peaceful retreat where they could reflect on their journey. Visitors often commented on its beauty, not knowing it had been planted by hands that had nearly been stilled forever. "Next week's that big medical conference," her father reminded them. "They want us to talk about the long-term impact of our experience." The girl smiled, remembering how nervous she'd been at their first conference. Now she spoke confidently about their experience, helping medical professionals understand the importance of combining technology with human intuition. Their story had evolved from a personal miracle to something bigger. A reminder that death isn't always as final as it seems, that love can bridge gaps science can't explain, and that sometimes the most important medical discoveries come from listening to the heart. As the sun set over their garden, casting long shadows across the flowers her father had planted, the girl realized their miracle hadn't ended that day in the funeral home. It continued to grow, touching lives, changing medical practices, and reminding people never to give up hope. "You know what, Dad?" she said, watching the last rays of sunlight paint the sky. "I think the real miracle wasn't just that you came back. It's everything that's happened since, all the lives changed, all the hope restored." He squeezed her hand, tears in his eyes. And it all started with a daughter who wouldn't say goodbye. Their story wasn't just about cheating death anymore. It was about the power of love, the importance of trust, and the reminder that sometimes, when we listen to our hearts instead of just our heads, miracles can happen. As they sat together in their garden of second chances, surrounded by the beauty that had grown from their experience, they knew their miracle would continue touching lives for years to come. The end.